Well, the South African Revenue Service has issued a media release talking about crossing a historic 2 trillion mark in net revenue collection. And this is the first time this number has been achieved. To tell us more, we're joined by Efficient Group's economist, Dawie Roodt, this morning. Dawie, good morning to you. Welcome to the show as always, and we do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you.
Yes, we've seen this media release from SARS, and we know that for a very, very long time, SARS has been relentless as far as revenue collections are concerned. And the fact that this milestone, 2 trillion, that has been surpassed in revenue collection has been achieved in 2025, 2026. What do you make of it, Tavi?
Yeah, I think a few things are important here. You're absolutely right. It's the first time, and most that they have collected in one financial year. If you compare it to the original estimates of the Minister of Finance in his budget a year ago, then they actually collected about 25 billion rand more than originally expected. And that's mostly because of value-added tax collections better than expected, personal income tax better than expected. But very importantly, we've seen quite a nice commodity cycle, commodity prices going up, and of course the mines also pay taxes, and they paid quite a lot of taxes. So those are the reasons why tax revenue exceeded the original estimate. But you're absolutely right in saying that SARS is, well, let's use the word actually quite aggressive. The South African economy overall is doing actually quite bad. There's hardly any economic growth, but despite that, the SARS is quite successful in collecting this amount of money. And if you compare it to the size of the economy or relative to GDP, you will find that it keeps on going up, and that is a sign that SARS is, well, very, very efficient and squeezing every last drop of blood out of this economy. Now, one can argue whether it's a good thing or not, and that's a valid argument to talk about that and to discuss that, whether it's a good thing or not. But for now, without a doubt, SARS is being quite successful in collecting all this money.
Well, Dawie, as you mentioned, aggressive, and they've upped the game as far as revenue collections are concerned. And we've seen that they've committed thousands of employees and also other collection agencies to collect this money. And this is possibly one of the reasons because, every now and then we see an article appearing, SARS is going after taxpayers. And their focus, I think, to a large extent, has been on revenue collection. But there is a flip side to this as well, where we see that there are a number of concerns as far as SARS is concerned in terms of service delivery in other areas. For example, taking care of things like queries and to an extent, they've also made certain things very, very difficult for taxpayers to comply, to remain compliant, particularly in terms of providing other services.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think there are other issues that are important to be aware of as well. You're right that SARS has been quite aggressive. There's a lot of talk about SARS being overly aggressive in squeezing all this money out of the economy. And I did mention that the South African economy is growing very slow, and it simply means that remember the Minister of Finance depends on growth revenues under pressure. But despite that, he's actually successful in getting more money out of the economy, and that's a sign of how aggressive SARS actually is. But there are some other issues that we have to be aware of. One is that the tax base in South Africa is exceptionally narrow, which means very few individuals and very few companies pay just about all their taxes. So when SARS goes after somebody for money, he usually goes after the middle class and the high income categories because that's easier and that's where the relatively large amounts of money is. But because of the aggressive stance of SARS and because of the very, very narrow tax base in South Africa, the taxpayer is also getting quite aggressive in managing its own tax affairs. And there are various ways of doing that. Of course, you can be dishonest, for example. I'm not saying people should be or people are dishonest, but there are certainly people that are dishonest. But there are other ways of evading tax, and that is simply to emigrate or simply not to go to work, for example. And we are losing taxpayers in South Africa. We need to lower the tax burden on the economy. And the only way we can really do that sustainably is by growing the economy faster, so a stronger economy can actually provide more money to the Minister of Finance. And perhaps just the last comment that I think is very important to make as well. Remember, SARS' job is to take money out of the pockets of the private sector primarily. And they take it out of the pocket of the productive side of the economy, and they give it to the state, and the state is highly unproductive. So this money moved from the productive side to the unproductive side of the economy, and that's part of the reason why the South African economy is not performing quite well.
Well, I think, you've just summed it up so well, Dawie, because, we may be good at collecting, but when it comes to spending, this is where the problem is. So, you can collect this 2 trillion and you can talk about achieving milestones. The key issue is, how is this 2 trillion being spent? And there, we have a major problem. And I think this is the reason why, when we're talking of an economy that is not doing so good, and with the situation playing out globally at this point in time, with oil prices, what is taking place in the Middle East as well, this 2 trillion is a milestone achieved, but I think just going forward, clearly there are certain alarm bells that are ringing.
Without a doubt, and I think SARS knows this. And remember, SARS is just part of the state. It's part of the whole state apparatus. But if you listen to the way that they talk, it's quite clear that they want to distance themselves. They want to create this impression that they are a separate agency distant from the state, which of course they are not. But let's be honest, SARS is quite well run. One of the very, very few state institutions that are well run, and unfortunately we can't say that of most of the other state institutions. But they are well run. They are aware of the wastage taking place in the rest of the in the state expenditure, and that's part of the reason why they try to distance themselves from the state, trying to create this impression that they somehow some separate entity different from the state, which of course they are not.
Well, and just finally, obviously the current commissioner, Edward Kieswetter, obviously is now on his way out. I think he's in his final month of employment, and it's going to be interesting to see who his successor is going to be and how SARS is actually going to maintain, the performance and the standards that Edward Kieswetter has basically set for SARS.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, the new commissioner has been announced. I've just forgotten the name for a moment. But the new commissioner has been announced, and you're absolutely right. Under Kieswetter, SARS was certainly improved quite dramatically after the state capture years under Jacob Zuma. But like we've all said, we all understand and realize and accept that we have to pay taxes, but it's crucially important that our money must be well spent, and that certainly is not always the case.
Well, Dawie, thank you very much for that. And I know it's a public holiday, but you've taken time out for us here at Salam Media. All the best to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good day.
Efficient Group's chief economist, Dawie Roodt, was us this morning. We're going to go for a break. We come back. We take a look at the Knesset passing the death penalty law targeting Palestinians.